Okay. Hello? Yes. Well, thank you so much, and good afternoon, good evening to everyone. We are going to start the event about indigenous people's food systems as game changers of sustainability and resilience. My name is Jon. I'm the head of the Indigenous Peoples Unit in FAO, and I will be facilitating this session. And we have incredible set of panelists today here with us. Now, we're going to be talking about the importance of indigenous people's food and knowledge systems. As you know, in 2021, there was this summit on food systems to look at how to transform agri-food systems in the world to make them sustainable and resilient. And something that was extremely important was that for the first time at a plenary session, the scientific committee that was accompanying the UN Food System Summit recognized that indigenous people's food and knowledge systems are game changers for sustainability and resilience. This was not just a coincidence. It followed the work started by the Global Hub on Indigenous People's Food Systems that was created in 2018 and endorsed by a technical committee of agriculture in 2020. But more importantly, it followed the collective work that was done by the Global Hub in writing the White Wipala paper on indigenous people's food systems. The White Wipala paper, many of you have read, characterized the main distinctive features of indigenous people's food and knowledge systems, from food generation to food production, from incorporating cosmogony into the food, as well as aspects of health and well-being, and very importantly, the relation with Mother Earth and the respect of biodiversity and the respect of ecosystems. So today we have an incredible panel with us, and without any more further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to Darío Mejía Montalvo. Darío Mejía Montalvo is from the Zenu people in Colombia, and he's the chair of the UN Permanent Forum of Indigenous Peoples. Darío, thank you for being with us today, and you have the floor. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Esos aplausos no son para acá, ¿verdad? Son allá afuera. Muchas gracias, un saludo muy especial a todas, a todos que están acá en esta hora del día después de un montón de actividades que seguramente han tenido. Y muchas gracias, Jon, a FAO, a todos por organizar esta actividad sobre un proceso que, como lo menciona Jon en su introducción, no es un proceso reciente y tampoco es un proceso fácil, porque implica entrar a participar desde la mirada de los pueblos indígenas en discusiones que los estados y las corporaciones han venido desarrollando como un enfoque, la mayoría de las veces comercial y la mayoría de las veces segmentado. Se entiende la alimentación como el agregado de nutrientes para los seres humanos, y los pueblos indígenas, por el contrario, entienden la alimentación de manera integral y asociado necesariamente los derechos de alimentación al resto de sus derechos territoriales, derechos culturales, derechos políticos y sobre todo el derecho a seguir existiendo en el futuro como pueblos. Luego, esta discusión en el seno de la FAO, en el seno de las entidades que lideran este tema, yo creo que ha sido uno de los logros más importantes en tiempo reciente, que además es prometedor porque puede indicar a los países, orientar a los países la manera como incorporar el conocimiento de los pueblos indígenas en las políticas de orden nacional, en las políticas públicas. Yo he visto que después de la conformación de la coalición, que efectivamente fue un reto enorme, y recuerdo y saludo la iniciativa de los dirigentes indígenas que estuvieron en ese momento, se han venido sumando más países y se han venido también sumando otras organizaciones indígenas y entidades de la ONU, sobre todo las que están en Roma, han puesto sobre la mesa la necesidad de aumentar su articulación y trabajo común. De manera que esta es una gran oportunidad que hay para incorporar la visión de diversidad y los derechos de los pueblos indígenas en las discusiones sobre alimentación. Ya termino comentándoles que en una de mis visitas a Roma tuve la oportunidad de hablar con el señor director de FAO y le hacía estos comentarios, y yo lo que recibí como retroalimentación de parte del director fueron comentarios, yo digo, de vanguardia. O sea, es un director que pone la discusión de los pueblos indígenas en clave de derechos, y él mismo lo reconocía, y él mismo planteaba que este era un reto para la misma organización, fortalecer este diálogo, fortalecer los canales de comunicación. Incluso ofreció la posibilidad de fortalecer las plataformas que hablan y que trabajan específicamente los derechos de los pueblos indígenas al interior de las instituciones. Y también lo vimos muy activo en el reciente evento de juventudes que realizaron en FAO, y que se articula, digamos, en relación con estas discusiones, y también lo he visto en el trabajo articulado de las instituciones como FIDA y el Programa Mundial de Alimentos, de manera que vamos viendo pasos importantes. Hay mucho por hacer, hay todavía retos, pero sí es una gran oportunidad que se pueda seguir fortaleciendo la estrategia de la coalición. Muchas gracias, John, por la oportunidad, y ya seguiremos conversando al respecto.
Gracias, gracias Darío gracias por esas palabras de apertura y sobre todo por estar acá. Sabemos de lo apretada de su agenda. We know how busy you are, and we're extremely thankful for your leadership in the work of the Coalition on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems, and of course for all the support that you're giving. I want to acknowledge Ilaria Firmian. She's the head of the Indigenous Peoples Unit in IFAD. We work very closely with IFAD. IFAD is one of the Rome-based agencies working on agricultural development, agricultural funding. And like Darío is saying, one of the objectives that we have is to work closer together to make sure that indigenous peoples are at the center of the work that we do at Rome level with respect to food security. I want to pass the floor to Herb Naki Majak from the Ramat project. And Herb is the chair of the Fisheries Joint Management Committee of the Inuvik. He's also the director of the Inuit Circumpolar Circle. We're extremely happy to have you with us today, Herb. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the importance of those initiatives of co-creation of knowledges between indigenous and non-indigenous scientists that are working and that are a model for how the Global Hub and how Ramat is operating with respect to co-creating knowledge on indigenous people's food systems. Thank you so much for being with us, Herb. The floor is yours.
Kuyanani, Yon, and also to Dario for his comments. Really hit the nail on the top there. My name is Herb Nakimayak. I'm the Vice President of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Canada, and also the Chair of Fisheries Joint Management Committee in the Inuvik Settlement Region, which is the northwestern part of Canada, and also part of the AirMat project, which we have a partnership with the FAO, and actually a very well working one. And we're able to help change, drive policy to reflect Indigenous peoples also, as well as, not just a food hub, but, when we talk about Indigenous knowledge, it's certainly a place where food and knowledge systems collide and actually run parallel together. The organization that I chair, Fisheries Joint Management Committee, they've been doing research before I was born. So we have 50 years of beluga data, and we're able to affect change, and develop partnerships with indigenous peoples of the Amazon, because there's a lot of mercury, and our data is the longest data set. So we have mercury indicators for the last 50 years, and we're able to help put pieces together around this world of events, special events, when it comes to mercury release and things like that. So we're able to help, because a lot of other organizations only have 10, 12 years, but we're able to help this way. So we were able to give it to the Arctic Monitoring Assessment Program of the Arctic Council to help, and that's what we want to do. When we have capacity, we like to share. At the same time, too, Indigenous knowledge is so key when it comes to conservation of our areas. I think all the governments around the world now are just finally realizing that, hey, Indigenous people know what they're doing, and they know what they've been doing for a long time. I'm starting to see more and more governments look at Indigenous peoples and how we set our conservation goals and how we protect. And for my people, the Inuit, we do a lot of research on the species that we harvest. Whales, seals, fish, land-bearing mammals. Basically everything that we rely on, we do research on, so that we can look at their health, and in a way we know that we're harvesting, and we're harvesting safe foods for our children and grandchildren, especially for women and children. That's the most important when it comes to fostering good management. And when we talk about co-management, we work well with scientists to ensure that our knowledge system, our place in this world of science. So we're inclusive, and coming with an open mind, and at the same time too, we do our best to complement each other where we can. But at the same time, we have our beliefs, and we've been driving policy through Indigenous knowledge for a long time. I might have been in Pampers when they started, and still today, and it's still an effective way to manage. And it's all about those partnerships. And like I say, with the FAO, the AirMat, we're able to bring relevant researches to our region. We've been asking scientists, governments that we co-manage with, to bring relevant research to our region. Not just someone's going to do their PhD and take off, you'll never see them again. Those days are over. And when you have good collaboration between research, science and Indigenous knowledge holders, the outcome is actually quite amazing. We find out actually more than we actually know. And because at the same time, when we learn from each other, it's amazing what you can develop. And I believe sound policy is made with both Indigenous peoples in the Arctic. One of our biggest things right now is the Species at Risk Act. Folks want to uplist the ring seal to a species of special interest to become extinct in the next 30 years. But at the same time, there's no management systems within our country, and we're setting the tone to our country, saying that, look at how we manage foster, with the seal. It's not only food, it's clothing, it's an economy for the women who sew, and actually make, very amazing, intricate ways of bringing money into their family, because sometimes if it's a hobby, then why not make money off of it? And, that's just one aspect of. There's so many that I could talk about, and I don't have much time to talk about this. Otherwise, it might be an hour-long conversation. So we're pushing our government to do better, to look at the systems that we have in each of our communities in our regions, and say, hey, well, maybe you could learn from this. And it's never too late for governments to say, well, hey, let's give it a try. And that's what we're trying to do. And always be proud of who you are. Sometimes we get put down by scientists and say, oh, our knowledge doesn't really matter. But we've been surviving in the coldest climates in this world for a long time. People could learn a little bit from, especially scientists. So I just want to say thank you to Yon, and thank you to the panel here, and everybody actually here. I know it's late and all that, but I think that the collaboration between science and Indigenous peoples around this world, it really is coming closer and closer together, and it's that point where we could save a lot of places that are almost at the point of no return. And if we could bring our governance systems back to reflect us as a people within our countries, I think we're doing the right thing. Kuyainaini, Yon, and everybody.
Thank you so much, Herb, and I think we are the ones to thank you and your people for all the support that you've been giving, not only for us to learn and do better, but to also show other Indigenous peoples how to do, and particularly Indigenous youth. So I want to pass the floor to Ivan Ingram, advisor to the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus, and I think in a way Herb's words, as well as Dario's, talked about the importance of Indigenous youth. They are the present and the future. Ivan Ingram is a Wiradjuri, Aboriginal from Australia, and also Filipino man that lives in Brisbane, Australia. He has a bachelor's degree in law with honors and applied science on biotechnology. And he's undertaking his doctor on juridical science candidature at the University of Arizona in the US. Ivan, based on your experience, and you are one of the advisors of the UN Global Indigenous Youth Forum, based on the experience of the UN Global Indigenous Youth Forum and its outcomes, why indigenous and non-indigenous scientists need to listen to indigenous youth? And what are the contributions that the indigenous youth can provide in the generation of evidence and informing policy on the way forward? Over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jon, for the question. And I think this neatly follows on from the words that Herb gave and also the themes that Dario touched on. I'll start with some brief remarks about what the Global Indigenous Youth Forum is, and then turn to addressing the question, because the themes arising from the forum are quite essential to that. So this year I had the honour of returning to assist the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus as an advisor, as Jon mentioned, having previously served as the Pacific Regional focal point for a number of years. In the lead up to and during the Global Indigenous Youth Forum, the forum was hosted at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, which featured 481 Indigenous youth from around the world applying to participate in the forum. We were fortunate to have 186 attend in person, with a further 357 following online. This represented 7 sociocultural regions of the globe, 97 different Indigenous peoples groups, and over 93 different languages represented and spoken. An amazing representative turnout to the important discussion on the role that Indigenous people and particularly Indigenous youth have in the global arena, and particularly in respect of climate change and traditional food and knowledge systems. Arising from the outcomes of the forum is the preparation of the Rome Declaration on safeguarding future generations in times of food, social and ecological crises. The declaration will be touched on in more detail in tomorrow morning's side event, featuring a number of colleagues, brothers and sisters of mine from the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. But in relation to its relevance to the question of why is it important that scientists, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, are to listen to the voices of Indigenous youth, underscoring the outcomes of the forum was the notion, which I hope we're all very familiar with, nothing about us without us. What was apparent from the participation of the GIYF, or the Global Indigenous Youth Forum, was that Indigenous youth come with a variety of knowledge, skills and perspective. The participation cohort included frontline advocates, defenders, human rights defenders, agriculturalists, pastoralists, lawyers, scientists and entrepreneurs, to name a few. We certainly covered much of the spectrum of what Western knowledges would consider as professional streams, and the areas that we as Indigenous peoples see as serving out as our responsibilities to our respective Indigenous peoples we belong. It is that latter point that hits at the core of the question you've raised. So there's 3 points I wish to raise in relation to that. And firstly, which was touched on by Dario and Herb, of course, underscoring the importance of Indigenous knowledge. As Indigenous youth, we are the future custodians of the traditional knowledge, traditional laws and customs of our respective peoples. With this, we have insights from the lived experience, and that's because of the transmission of knowledge about our lands, waters, and ecological biodiversity that exists within our traditional territories. It has been shown through the methods of Western science that Indigenous knowledge, or as many people understand as traditional ecological knowledge, is a developed science, tried and tested from generation to generation. The second aspect is Indigenous peoples bring a unique perspective in the work that they involve themselves in. This perspective is underpinned by the traditional knowledge gained and absorbed from our elders who are our knowledge holders. This helps shape our worldview and perspectives, and when coupled with Western ideologies of structures and knowledge disciplines, or professions for want of a better word, this adds a further dimension to the expertise that we hold in the field, particularly in spaces where there are intersections between traditional knowledge and Western knowledges, such as in the space of food systems. And thirdly, my final point is that the challenge we face as a global community is one that must be faced collectively, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. This will require collaboration and joint efforts to preserve and protect traditional food systems. Indigenous peoples are already at the forefront of practicing and implementing sustainable approaches to food systems because our traditional food systems are inherently sustainable. We wouldn't continue to subsist since time immemorial if our systems of governance and systems around food were not resilient and sustainable. Now, as a takeaway of why it's important to listen to Indigenous youth, it's because we have a unique perspective. Many of us have also had the opportunity to gain skills and qualifications in the Western formal sense. And thirdly, we are practitioners already. It is the latter point that highlights why Indigenous youth have a role to play in providing direct experiential evidence supported by our traditional knowledge. And I guess just to finish off with two sort of recommendation points, for any forums that involve examining or studying food systems, and specifically Indigenous food systems, such as through the work by the Global Hub, it would be essential to include the voices and perspectives of Indigenous youths as advisors and as key stakeholders. Perhaps even at the next session of the Global Indigenous Youth Forum or any Rome-based forums on food and agriculture, there'd be dedicated sessions in respect of the impacts to Indigenous people's food and knowledge systems that aim at raising awareness from threats of harm and seek to develop opportunities to affect meaningful change. Some areas to explore could involve the impact of ultra-processed foods and low nutritional foods on Indigenous peoples and their food systems. Thank you, Jon.
Thanks to you, Ivan, for the amazing work that you have done, and I think we take note of the recommendations from the youth, and absolutely. I want to pass the floor to Dr. Massimo Torero. Massimo Torero is the chief economist of FAO, and he has joined the organization in 2019 as Assistant Director General for the Economic and Social Development Department. But something important, extremely important, is that Massimo Torero has been supporting the work of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' food systems for a long time. And he played a fundamental role in supporting in the exchanges of knowledge that the Global Hub had with the Scientific Committee in 2021 to present the White Wipala paper. Massimo, thank you for being with us. We know you're extremely busy because you have a packed agenda, but we are honored to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, and a real pleasure to be with you today, as always, trying to be part of what you are doing. The first thing I wanted to talk is about this concept of food systems, because you keep calling it indigenous food systems. I think we should start to change to agri-food systems, because it's a lot more than food. Agri is a longer concept. It's not just crops, it's everything, for FAO, at least for the definition of FAO. So I think it will be important to start to rethink, because the way you look at the system is holistically. And that implies not only what you produce for eating, or what you extract from the nature for eating, but also what you use for producing clothes, for producing many other things. All those create returns and incomes. And all of those will affect the climate. And it's very difficult to separate them. Because if we just call it food systems, then it's only a piece of it, and you're missing all the other part, which have all the cultural content, everything that you are doing in the whole system that you are operating. So I will just plead that you talk about this and discuss about this, because it's important to take advantage of all the knowledge that you have across the system, and which affects, of course, climate, affects nature and biodiversity, and you need to protect biodiversity and climate. So it's a very important thing to look at it. Now, when we start the food system, one of the things that for me was central on the indigenous people is exactly this holistically approach, because you were the only ones really bringing the system approach to a discussion. Normally, everything is look at sectors. No, in the work we do, we look at different sectors: agriculture, environment, split. They're not together. And the whole idea of the summit was to break those silos and to bring them together. And you're ready, you always do that. That's part of your culture, the way you operate. And that's why we wanted to bring this knowledge together, and that's why the importance of the Waipala paper that you prepare for the scientific group of the Food System Summit. It was extremely important because it's trying to put and conceptualize what you were historically doing, and which will benefit enormously to break these silos that we normally have in the formal sector that we operate. So building up on the hub, and I am very happy that FAO is hosting the hub. I think that there is a lot of knowledge sharing that we have to do, and a lot of knowledge sharing of trying to bring indigenous group with non-indigenous groups. The work that you do when you come to the World Food Forum, for example, the last 2 years, have been amazing. You really have helped us to transform and to move together across the board of the food system of the World Food Forum. And I don't know what will happen next year, but I hope we can continue, because it's a way to start to create these linkages and not look at both separately, because it's a mistake. I think we need to integrate your systems with the way we are looking at systems. Is the only way we can move forward. So those things are extremely important, and trying to start to formalize your knowledge also, so that we can bring more evidence and trying to make others to move. Now, there are very complex drivers happening right now. 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries are being crossed. Biodiversity is being affected. Land expansion continues to happen. Urbanization will continue to grow. And that will put a lot of pressure in the indigenous systems. It will put a lot of pressure, and we need to learn how to work together to minimize those risks. You need to be resilient to these changes, and you need to be able to really increment the knowledge that you have also to be able to defend yourselves against these pressures that will come and will be happening. And we know those things will be happening. These are things that will be very difficult to move backward. We're trying to create a transformation, we call it, of the agri-food systems, but that will take time, and that will be something complex and difficult. We are developing tomorrow, we are launching the roadmap to SDG 2 and 1.5 degrees Celsius, which basically is trying to tell the world that the food systems and the agri-food systems provide something that we need: food, an income through the non-food activities. And that's the right to food that we have. And if we are not careful and we just think on climate side without understanding the importance of the right to food, we're making a mistake. Yes, it's true that the agri-food systems could create some externalities, could affect soils, could affect land, could affect the environment. But on the other hand, it's a huge opportunity, because we can work more efficiently. We can increase our efficiencies in how we operate, and we can try to minimize those problems that we are creating to the nature. So it's a sector that needs to attract climate interest and climate investment, and it's a sector that needs to take into account the importance of the biodiversity, the importance of the way indigenous peoples are handling the biodiversity and their nature, so that we can minimize those externalities. So the next years will be very complex, in my impression. Significant frequency of chokes, significant problems because of the need of more food, the lack of better resources, so we will have to produce a lot more with less, and without expanding our land, and using it in a more efficient way. And let's hope that we can work together so that we can respect all the principles behind what you do, and trying to find a harmony in the way you operate, but across the agri-food systems, so that this transformation can happen in a good way to get the outcomes that we want. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Massimo, for those words. I want to pass the floor to Professor Francisco Rosado May from the Universidad Intercultural Maya de Quintana Roo. Professor Francisco is a member of the Global Hub, but is a professor at the university. He's an expert in agroecology and intercultural higher education. Francisco, you've been doing indigenous people's voices and perspectives of ecosystem restoration practices. And what are the main recommendations that the Global Hub provided on the standards of practices on ecosystem restoration that support the UN Decade of Restoration? Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. And I like to address John's questions, building on what Dr. Torero just mentioned. And I think the framework to do that is precisely the title of this panel. Is the how can we, indigenous peoples with our agri-food systems, can be game changers. And for that, we need to understand what is the game that needs to be changed. And I think that the name of the game that needs to be changed is the unsustainable systems. And if those are the changes, those are the systems that need to be changed, the question is, how can indigenous people's knowledges can help in these changes? So then it becomes a game changer. And for that, we can just look at the research that is done around indigenous food systems. And we can find, for instance, that the concept of land equivalent ratio was demonstrated on indigenous systems, food systems. that the concept of multi-trophic interactions was demonstrated on indigenous food systems. And that indigenous food system also understand their systems differently than conventional systems. For instance, in any indigenous language, there is no word that can be translated literally to weeds. We only have plants growing together with crops. And for instance, in Tabasco, the chontales call it monte, call it buen monte or mal monte, depending on the effect of that particular plant to the crop. If it is a good monte, it has a good effect, it cools off the soil. If it is a bad monte, it has a bad effect on the crop and heats up the soil. And so there is a non-weed concept in our thinking. And it turns out that based on those evidences, there are allelopathic properties that explain the either good or bad role of those plants growing together with the crops. So we do have knowledge that science has demonstrated that is as valid as scientific knowledge, and therefore we can participate in this game-changing process. And to do so, we need to think of co-creating then the knowledge that is needed to make the changes in the game that we are now having problems with. And that is called co-creation of knowledge. But we, many people, amongst them myself, would like to think of it as intercultural co-creation of knowledge, which means that co-creation can happen when people get together and do something together. But if the same line of thinking is in these two people, the result is aligned with the same line of thinking. But the idea of co-creation has to do with different ways of understanding our systems. And that's where the indigenous peoples have their own ways of learning, of creating, of innovating, and transmitting knowledge, different than science does. But if we can work together, knowing that the knowledge behind our systems, our sustainable systems, and by the way, not all indigenous systems are sustainable, many of them are now not sustainable, then we have common ground where we can build bridges between different cultures and then together be game changers. So those are the type of discussions that we're having at the Hub. And those are the type of things that indigenous peoples are open to participate in this process of game changing. And that's why we say that indigenous peoples' knowledge systems and food systems can be game changers in the work that we need to do in our food systems now. Thank you, John.
Thanks to you, Dr. Rosado May, for those very important words. I would like to pass the floor to Dr. James Ford from the University of Leeds. Professor Ford has been working on the resilience of indigenous people's food systems under a One Health approach. Let me give you some of the insights of his extensive bio, like all the panelists that we have. He's a Priestley Chair in Climate Adaptation at the Priestley Center for Climate Futures at the University of Leeds. And he's a dual British and Canadian citizen who for more than 20 years has collaborated with indigenous peoples all over the world. James, tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing, but very importantly, tell us what are the conclusions of your research on what are the main drivers of resilience of indigenous people's food systems. How does your research contribute to the current work on the Global Hub on indigenous people's food systems? And we would like to hear a little bit about the work that you're doing in the COVID-19 and in the IPON network. I'm going to ask you to speak from the atrial, because otherwise the camera cannot see you, and we want all of our colleagues that are following online to also see you. So please accept my apologies, and if you don't mind speaking from here, thank you so much.
Observatory Network, or IPON for short. And I very, very important. I've done a lot of work myself in the past in the Arctic with Inuit communities. And there, the ability to use a diversity of environments and animals is really important in helping them manage some of the climate change impacts we're seeing. Other issues that have come up in our network include the importance of community leadership and cohesion. Sharing and kinship are very, very important. So again, during the pandemic, we saw households helping each other out. We saw fishing households supplying fish to those households who were farming and harvesting. Very, very important. We also seen new institutions emerge to manage some of the stresses we're seeing. So amongst Dagaba partners in Ghana, we've seen savings unions emerging at a community level to help provide investment to households as some of these challenges. Now, moving forward, the Global Hub is a key partner in the work that we do, and we've been kind enough to receive some seed funding from FAO and from the University of Leeds for this work. And over the next few months, we're going to be working on the Wipala paper on Indigenous peoples and pandemics, looking at what lessons we can learn from the Indigenous people's experience of COVID on food systems. What are some of the lessons? And we're building upon our own network, but also work done by other people as well. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, James. Thank you so much for those examples of the ongoing research that you're doing with Indigenous peoples, local level, but also for some of the indications of the way forward. I want to pass the floor to Francisco von Hildenbrand from Gaia Amazonas, Pacho, for those of us that know him for many years, to tell us a little bit about the role of collective rights in biodiversity preservation in the context of the Amazon basin. Francisco is also one of the founding members of the Global Hub. He's the CEO of Gaia Amazonas, a Colombian NGO with the mission to protect the Amazon, among other things. And Francisco has been working with Gaia Amazonas since 1990. And so he has a lot of experience about the work that is taking place in the Amazon basin and in different contexts. I would like to ask you, Francisco, to tell us a little bit about what are the current threats to the access of land and territories and natural resources that indigenous peoples face in the Amazon basin, particularly in the areas where you work in Colombia. And also tell us a little bit about the work that the Global Hub is doing in finalizing this new Wipala paper on mobile indigenous peoples and the collective livelihoods in different parts of the world. I'm going to ask you also to speak from here, if that is okay with you, for 2-3 minutes so that they can see you in the camera. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Buenas tardes a todos y todas. Well, from 1990s working, it's been like 3 generations. My grandparents dedicated their life to work with supporting indigenous peoples in a time of a struggle to get out from slavery. Then my parents have dedicated their life as well, and so I've grown up in that context as an ally, as a partner in supporting their cause. And regarding your questions, there are many threats that pressure indigenous territories, indigenous rights, and there are the visible ones that we hear about: land grabbing, deforestation, mining. Those are the visible ones. But what I've learned through this time working hand in hand with communities is that there are many other invisible or not so tangible threats, but that are as critical and as negative, which come in the form of different programs and policies that have an impact on traditional knowledge. Programs and policies on education, on health, on markets that do not take into account indigenous knowledge systems. And indigenous knowledge systems are integrated with indigenous food systems. When you have an educational system that does not take into account a language and a way of relating to the land and to the earth and to the knowledge of seed diversity, it does have an impact. When you have a public school that serves 3 times a day Western food, it does have an impact. So what I've learned on this path is that indigenous food systems, yes, it relates to rights, it relates to culture, it relates to, in many cultures, to gender-based knowledge, which is a specialization on specific ecosystems. It relates to education, it relates to health. It relates to different sectors. It is an integral approach. It is at the very core of governance and land management. Seed diversity in indigenous food systems is a great way of regenerating ecosystems and making biodiversity stronger. It is at the very heart. Some of you who were yesterday at a panel with a local indigenous representative of Colombia, he was mentioning as part of the core of the work that they do in indigenous local governance is indigenous food systems. So you cannot separate indigenous traditional knowledge with governance and the different type of sectors. And then embedding that into public policy making and really having the ear and attention of central government decision makers and policy makers, that the world view that embeds in indigenous food systems, that integrates different sectors, is at the very core of not only the well-being of communities, but of the well-being of the forest and of the well-being of the planet. And there is where we need to understand that there is a new way of understanding what the well-being of the Amazon and what conservation strategies look like. Many times it's difficult to get the attention from state actors into listening to what indigenous organizations set forth with their territorial management plans, life plans, based on indigenous food systems and complex systems of knowledge. But we do see a change. Just 2 weeks ago, there was a meeting between 5 indigenous local governments and the Ministry of Agriculture of Colombia. And I have to say that I was amazed by the level of conversation from the officials of the Ministry of Agriculture, referring to indigenous food systems in the same lines that we're talking about here. And this conversation would have been impossible 10 years ago. It would have just not happened. Yesterday in the panel, the Minister of Agriculture could not come, but they sent a video highlighting the importance of relating indigenous food systems, not just to markets, but yes to knowledge, yes to tradition, and yes to land forest management. And that's a huge shift. And that comes thanks to precisely spaces like this, the Global Hub, that unites voices from indigenous peoples from around the world, that unites the weight from institutions and the support of institutions such as the FAO. And it is within this local to global alliance that it's possible to establish before impossible conversations. So I think that there is a way forward, and I think that we're on the right track. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pacho, for those words. We have some time to discuss and to have a discussion, and I want to acknowledge many of you, because many of you are very important for the work collectively that we are doing. We have Dr. Didas with us, but I see Danny Hunter, one of the founders of the Global Hub, that is with us. Also the ambassador from South Africa and current chair of the just elected of the CFS, the Committee on World Food Security. Congratulations, Ambassador. We are very happy also because thanks to the collective work of the coalition and the Global Hub, and with people like Herb and Francisco, there was a proposal sent forward to include indigenous people's food systems in the program of work of the CFS, and this has been included. So we are moving forward. I also want to acknowledge Hilaria, Luisa, Marina. And something very important is the Global Hub. We had a meeting in March this year, and there was a tremendous interest from many other organizations, indigenous organizations and institutions, to join the work on the Global Hub. So we grew, and we are now 31 members. And actually, there's a lot of diversity. This is just a small group. And there's many women that are working in the Global Hub. You don't see them here today. We have a male-dominated panel, which is actually an exception, because most of the meetings we have are female-dominated. No? So this is an exception. But I want to give the opportunity to many of you to interact in the discussion. And we have some time. So if you want to raise your hand and ask one of the questions to the panelists, or if any of you wants to take the floor, now is the time before we move into the closure and the way forward. So help me out, colleagues, friends, collaborators, women of the world, indigenous women.
John, if just to warm up, can
Please,
I make
Francisco.
a comment before somebody else. I was just thinking that here we heard the term agri-food systems compared to food systems. And I was just thinking, why is it that we indigenous peoples are more fond of using food systems than agri-food systems? We also were growing cotton for our clothes and other fibers, but not in monocrops. Those plants, cotton was growing within our food systems. So that's why we are more fond of using food systems than agri-food systems. However, things have changed. Yes, things have changed. And many indigenous systems now have monocrops. So we have to, have clear these systems as well. Thank you, John. So, somebody with a question?
Herb, please.
Thank you, Kuyanani, for that, Doctor. I agree. I agree because I think when you look at the big picture as a collective, it actually takes away from the food systems because we rely on food systems for, and growing is part of it as well too. But where I come from, it's 8 months of the year. It's there's snow and it's cold and it's frozen. There's ice. So for us, we really need to ensure that we don't lose that. Otherwise, if we lose it, if it's a collective, then we're losing some of the really, really meaningful impact things when it comes to, especially quotas, fish, wildlife species, and other ones that we really rely on. I think we need to kind of have a clear definition of it, is what we need to have before we put it all together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I see that Darío also wants to take the floor. I'm looking at the audience. I would like to also take Ambassador, please, and then Darío. I know that Massimo also wants to say something. Do we have a microphone for the audience?
Okay, acá. Creo que lo tengo.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the panelists. My name is Nosipo, and I'm grateful to be here. Just having listened to the panelists, the puzzling question that was posed by Maximo, why do we choose to speak about food systems, not necessarily about agri-food systems? And I think this is a complex question especially also for the indigenous people to unpack further. It's also just in my role, firstly as a South African that comes from people with indigenous knowledge applications on food, on plants, on medicines, or medicinal plants per se. And the question that I have is whether, as Indigenous Peoples Forum, you also can spell out one or two of the major implications of climate change, because we are talking about indigenous knowledge in the context of agri-food systems or food systems, but with a nexus of climate change. And I heard the earlier comment that there are opportunities within the indigenous knowledge systems in respect of managing ecosystems differently than what we tend to do, and we think about indigenous peoples at the end instead of at the forefront. So what then is the real threat, and what can be done about that? And my last comment is now on the coherence of governance systems. This is a platform where we have the FAO, we have who was speaking on One Health. I can't remember the institution's name, but that being an international platform, where do all of this cohere? Where do things come together very well, both in terms of coordinating the response on how best we utilize indigenous knowledge systems in the context of food or agri-food systems? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for those words. I'm going to ask somebody to help us with the microphone to pass it over to Darío. He already has a microphone, so let's leave that one with the audience. Darío, please, briefly, and then we take some more questions.
Gracias, John, y también gracias a la señora embajadora y también a todos quienes están presentes. Yo quiero iniciar primero reconociendo y valorando todo el trabajo que están haciendo cada uno de mis colegas del panel, y también a mi colega Máximo por su preocupación. Yo creo que su manifestación, su propuesta refleja el compromiso por mejorar el lugar que ocupan los pueblos indígenas en la discusión. No obstante de ello, pues yo creo que las expresiones que escuchamos de que para los pueblos indígenas la alimentación no es un asunto de nutrientes ni agrícola, sino que es integral, tiene que ver con la educación, con la salud, sobre todo con sus territorios. Esto nos deja, en el lugar de plantearlo de manera integral, así su comprensión pueda tener efectos limitados en principio. Pero creo que luego, cuando lo empezamos a explicar, por qué podemos entendernos. Y de hecho, también saludo al doctor Juan Carlos Mendoza, que lo veo por acá. Y de hecho, por eso el trabajo de la coalición implica una coordinación interinstitucional, no solo con las otras entidades que trabajan asuntos relativos a la alimentación en Roma, sino con las otras agencias de la ONU. Y en el nivel internacional, los gobiernos han creado los mecanismos especiales que asesoran a las Naciones Unidas sobre las cuestiones indígenas, y una de esas es el Foro Permanente que ahorita su servidor está presidiendo, y lo que hemos recomendado, justamente lo que usted está planteando, señora embajadora, la coherencia en el reconocimiento que se hace a los pueblos indígenas en documentos tan importantes como la Declaración de Naciones Unidas, y luego la manera como se plantean las políticas de nivel sectorial. Buscar ese equilibrio es muy importante. Y finalmente, en relación con su comentario de la relación entre la discusión de alimentación y los temas de cambio climático, creo que, por ejemplo, los compañeros del Ártico están viendo gravemente afectados sus sistemas alimentarios por el cambio del clima, por el cambio de la contextura del suelo, por las disminuciones de las posibilidades de pesca en muchos lados, pero también se están viendo afectados los pueblos indígenas de selva y de páramos, porque los cambios de temperatura hacen que las mismas plantas o los animales estén movilizándose hacia nuevos escenarios, hacia nuevos lugares, precisamente por el cambio de las temperaturas del clima. Y entre otras, la otra razón es porque los pueblos indígenas han tenido siempre sus sistemas alimentarios amparados en el principio de equilibrio con la naturaleza. Esta división entre naturaleza y cultura no es real en la perspectiva de los pueblos indígenas, sino una ficción impuesta por otro tipo de perspectiva. Creo que podemos hablar muchísimo sobre esto, pero he intentado resumirlo en estos tres puntos. Muy amable y muchas gracias nuevamente.
Thank you, Darío, for that comment. And I think if I can reflect on the comment from Her Excellency, the Ambassador of South Africa, probably the CFS give us an opportunity as well to connect the discussions between the coalition, the Global Hub, the UN Permanent Forum, with the countries to continue this dialogue that we are not going to finalize here because it's a long one. And I remember in the March when we met with the Global Hub, we had a long discussion about agri-food systems, and it was agreed by the Global Hub to maintain the term of indigenous people's food and knowledge systems, because it was a very lengthy discussion that I'm sure is going to continue. And I'm sure that our goal as agencies like IFAD, FAO, WFP is to maintain this process going so that we can all, in a way, learn from each other. I know that Massimo wants to also react, to give some words. and then I would like to provide a couple of insights on the way forward, if you allow me. Massimo, please.
Very briefly, and thank you for your explanation. I think it makes a lot of sense, and yours too, because it's saying that we need to evolve. And there are two ways in which we look at this, okay? One is, of course, how we use the system to provide what we need. And it can provide it through direct food, and it can provide it through different mechanisms, through income. And especially, as I understand the indigenous systems, they absorb all the biomass of what they consume. So they are the perfect bioeconomy, if you want to put it in that way. So they are looking at both things. So that's one part, the consumption and the culture and the way we manage the system. But the second part is the impacts that we generate. And there is where it becomes, if we're talking of a system, we have to look at all the impacts. And the impacts will come from the food and non-food, for sure. And that's where the system with the climate and the environment is what is relevant. No? The use of water, the use of land, the use of emissions, generation of emissions, and so on. So I think it's for discussion. It's something that we need to keep working on. But let's think on both dimensions, not only the consumption side, but also the impacts to the world, because normally we are missing a piece which is extremely important, fibers, as you said, and so on, that we need to include in the process to completely bring the system together and be able to account for the benefits and the impacts of the system.
Thank you so much, Massimo. They are telling us that we need to wrap up. But I want to ask my friend and colleague Ilaria to join me for the wrapping up. Ilaria, join me, please, with the panelists, and we are going to. Ilaria is a sister, a colleague. She's the head of the Indigenous Peoples in IFAD. Let's give a round for Ilaria. So, in a way, with IFAD and FAO, we are working in the coalition on Indigenous Peoples food systems. The coalition has the purpose of advance on policy recommendations on food systems, on Indigenous Peoples food systems. It brings the expertise and the evidence gathered from the Global Hub, and it brings the discussion that we have in the Rome group of friends, where IFAD is also very active, to take this in a way forward that can inform the future of food systems and the transformation of agri-food systems, but also to support the work and to support the continuation of Indigenous Peoples food and knowledge systems that are disappearing in some cases. So, Ilaria, we need to continue working together. And
we will.
And help us with some words as well that talked about the work that we are doing on the coalition.
Yeah, no, maybe just to add that, I mean, you have said everything, but definitely I think there is a lot of contribution that comes also from the project experience we all have as FAO and IFAD that contributes to the coalition in terms of learning best practices and that provide guidance then to the policy that we want to influence through the coalition. And maybe just one thought in this context of the COP, I think here is one of the few, in the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion is one of the few places where when we talk about solutions for climate resilience, we focus a lot on governance of resources, which is something that I think outside of this space, the focus is more on solutions that are more technological or different types of approaches, but governance is often left out, while I think this is possibly the most key aspect, and I think that it's one of the key areas of work also for the coalition in terms of policy influence. Thank you.
So thank you so much. Thank you to you, Ilaria, and to IFAD for all the constant collaboration. And thank you so much for having joined us. Let's give a round to our panelists. Thank you so much. Photo? Yes.